Hey everyone, and thanks so much for checking out this tutorial where I'll show you how I painted this little guy. If you haven't checked out the previous video in the series, please do so. It's a little walkthrough on how I assembled the model using some scenic basing techniques. I had heaps of fun working on this little project, and I hope it inspires you to work on something similar for yourself. After priming the model grey, I started off with working on the stone. And so I'm a big believer in working from the inside out when you're tackling a model, and I knew that some of the stonework was going to be obscured by other parts, particularly the lizard, so I decided to work on those first. And I went for a warm grey, which was graphite by AK Interactive. The warm hue sort of helps to convey a bit of a worn and almost ancient kind of look, which I thought was quite fitting for a jungle kind of environment. So starting to sort of shade things down a bit, I went for a deeper warm grey, which was ash grey by AK Interactive. I started off by glazing this into the shadows. In some areas I applied it more kind of like an all over shade. And then sort of picked out some of the recesses in the stone, building up the glazing in layers. And then I decided to deepen the recesses a bit more with Wildwood, which is a contrast paint. I did thin it down a little bit just to help with the flow, and glazed this around inside the recesses, and also glazed it to emphasize the kind of dirty, weathered look. And of course, because it is a jungle sort of environment, I wanted to add some green, and so I used Athenian camo shade just to add some glazes of that in. Highlighting was quite simple, and it just involved picking out some of the edges and details with the graphite, which was the base color. And also built in a little bit of texture into the stone using my kind of scratchy stippling kind of technique that I use. And this was refined with Administratum Grey to sort of sharpen the highlights and pick out some of the details. There were a few areas of the sand I noticed which were obscured by the lizard also, so I decided to work on that next. And I know it probably feels like I'm working on the most boring parts first, but bear with me because I gotta stick to the plan. I've got to stick to my philosophies, working from the inside out. So after base coating the sand with Baneblade Brown, I just started doing sort of patchy glazes of varying browns, starting with Still Legion Drab, and then Gawthor Brown in a smaller amount, more sparingly. And then even more sparingly with Dryad Bark. And this kind of helped me to define some of the recesses a bit. And then brought the Baneblade Brown back for highlighting, which is kind of mostly an overbrushing sort of technique where I just kind of run the brush over some of the grains of sand and over some of the sort of rock textures just to pick out the highlights. Okay, now we'll work on the lizard. Okay, hang on, maybe there's one last thing. He's perched on this sort of gold ornamental kind of part of the stone, so I decided to get that out of the way first. I didn't want to mess up his tail or his legs later on. I used my go-to mix for gold base coats lately, which is a 50-50 of Retributor Armor and Rune Lord Brass. I then started off the shading with thinned down Gore Grunter Fur, which is a contrast paint, and just sort of did some glazes into the shadows. I really love Gore Grunter Fur for glazing gold because it really adds a nice richness. And then some of the recess shading was enhanced in contrast with some Wildwood, and I did a little bit of glazing onto the surface as well. So I didn't actually film this bit, but I did do some light glazes of Athonian Camo shade and Coelia Green shade, just to kind of give it that tarnished sort of look and kind of give it the jungle vibe. And all I did with the highlights was just bring back the base mix. And I intentionally didn't go overly bright with the highlighting because I wanted to preserve that aged look. Right, here we are at last. And I wanted to go with quite a bright, vibrant green, like your typical iguana, so I base coated him with moot green. So for the shadows, I started to work in a bit of soft shading by mixing a bit of Cabalite green into moot green. I glaze this into the recess areas and contours of the body. I did also glaze this towards the end of the tail. I wanted to kind of have this shift in color towards the tail, being kind of cooler tones with this teal sort of hue. I emphasized the shading with straight Cabalite green again, kind of lined in, but also a little bit of soft shading towards the shadows. With the Cabalite green, I also took the opportunity to start building up some of the stripes along the back. This was quite a noticeable thing in the reference photo that I used for the iguana. And I thought it was a really cool little thing that I could add to the model. Cabalite green was also glazed further down the tail too. I started off the highlights with an equal mix of moot green and dawn yellow, which is this nice pale, vibrant green. And after doing some of this highlighting, I did decide I wasn't quite happy with the depth I'd added, so I used a bit of Lupercal green to add some more shading. It is totally normal and fine to kind of go back and forth between shading and highlights if adjustments need to be made. If something's not quite working, just go back, do a little bit more shading if you can, because you're really trying to build a nice contrast. You can also see more of that teal shading built up on the tail and also some of the highlights there, which was actually a mix of Cabalite green and dawn yellow to sort of get that highlight color and keep it consistent with the teal color shift towards the end of the tail. I tried to think of a way to have the lizard's face stand out, so I kind of shifted those colors to a bit more of a drab kind of green. So Krieg Khaki was mixed into moot green. And then those highlights were sharpened with pure Krieg Khaki. So I have to admit, it was getting quite tricky to film some of the parts while I was painting, particularly the finer details on the face. But in all, I did kind of push the shading a bit more, mixing a bit of black into the Cabalite green. And I used that to sort of emphasize the recesses a bit more and also help those stripes to stand out. I mixed a bit of white into the respective colors for highlighting the skin, just to kind of pick out those details a bit more. And the eyes, they were quite tricky. But I did a dot of Avalan Sunset, a little bit of Uriel Yellow to kind of make it pop a bit more, and then just a dot of black and a tiny dot of white, and I did use a magnifying headset for this, otherwise I would not have been able to do it properly. So I wanted to have a variety of greens for the leaves just to kind of make things look a bit more natural. The first one I started off with was Lorraine Forest for these ones. As well as Warboss Green. And Elysian Green. I definitely think that a bit of variety keeps things interesting, and they do look a bit vibrant now, but we are going to shade them down and highlight a bit, so it's going to make them look a little less punchy. The shading was built up on the Lorraine Forest one by mixing in an equal part of Vulcan Green. So one thing to note here is that I am shading towards the end of the leaves. I did point out in the assembly video that I was going to point out how I intentionally painted some of these parts to lead the eye towards the center of the model and keep the focus on the lizard. And the shading was built up towards the end of these leaves using straight Vulcan Green to build up that contrast. And built up even more just by mixing a little bit of black into the Vulcan Green. This is kind of what I'm getting at. So shading towards the end of the leaves keeps the lightest part closest to the focal point, which is at the center of the base. And I think it sort of helps to not draw the eye towards the tip of the leaf, which would be leading us out and away from where we want the eye to look. And the highlights were kind of the fun part of painting the leaves. I used Lorraine Forest for these ones just to pick out that stem and also add some of these lines that are kind of the fibrous kind of pattern on the leaves. And then Elysian Green was used to sharpen these and emphasize them a bit more. For the second color of plants, I mixed in a bit of Caliban Green into the Warboss Green to glaze in some darker tones. Again, focusing on pushing this towards the end of the leaf. This was then enhanced with pure Caliban Green glazes. Bringing back Warboss Green just to pick out some of the highlights, again focusing on the stem and then adding those lines to emphasize the pattern on the leaf. And then again with Elysian Green just to sharpen things a bit. And there was actually that third plant that I had there, the one that I base coated with Elysian Green, and I really went back and forth a lot. I couldn't get it to work how I wanted it to look. So I didn't actually film that because it was just too hard to kind of figure it out. But I went with a lot more drab kind of colors. And I think later on I actually glazed in some Barrack Nard Burgundy, which gave it a more purpley kind of green kind of look, which I really liked actually. So moving on now to these little roots, and I decided to go with a warm chestnut sort of hue and started off with an equal mix of Doombull Brown and Rhinox Hide. The sand is quite light in tone, so I wanted something that contrasted with that a bit. So the roots being a little bit darker kind of set them off a little bit. So some shading was applied with a 2:1 mix of Rhinox Hide and black, which was from AK Interactive. And much like with everything else that I've done, I've reintroduced the base coat mix to tidy things up a bit and sort of lay the foundations for some of the highlighting. Straight Doombull Brown was laid over to enhance the highlights and following the shape and contour of the roots. I then mixed a bit of Gawthor Brown into Doombull to start sharpening things up a bit. And at this point, it kind of add a bit of texture and bring out sort of that woody, fibrous kind of look in the root. And finally, some of the parts were picked out with pure Gawthor Brown. Alright, time to move on to the lizard's little snack bowl. So I didn't want them to be all the same color. I thought that might be a bit boring, so I decided to do them a couple of different colors. Starting with the purpley ones, I began with Xerius purple, and then started picking out some fine highlights with Cacophony purple. And then just some small dots of Decala lilac to give them a slightly shiny appearance. The teal one began with Cabalite green, and some finer highlights of Cyberite green, and then finally dot highlights with a bit of white mixed into the Cyberite. And the last thing to paint is the skull, and I wanted to have a slightly earthy green hue to it to sort of follow that pattern that we're going for here. So I started base coating with Iron Rack Skin. I then added a soft shade with Creed Khaki, which also has a slight green tint to it. And then a mix of Castellan Green and Catachan Flesh were soft shaded into the deep contours and recesses. A bit more contrast was built up by soft shading in an equal mix of Castellan Green and then this time Rhinox Hide. If you're wondering about the masking tape, I just put it there to protect the lizard. You know, I'd finished the paint job for that, so I didn't want to screw it up by getting some of the shading for the skull onto it. And a bit more Rhinox Hide was added to that previous mix to build up the strongest shading right in the deep recesses in the eye sockets and stuff like that. And then we brought back the Iron Rack Skin and glaze towards the raised areas. And added a bit of texture in with the stippling kind of scratchy technique. And to finish off the highlights, I just added a little bit of white into the Iron Rack Skin to create some of those sharper highlights on the edges. So even with the plants that were there already, the ones that we painted, I decided it wasn't quite enough vegetation for a deep jungle sort of look, so I did add some tufts. And as you can see, I used a variety of different products just to kind of help things look a bit more natural. The one on the left without the label is the moss pads from Mini Nature. This is totally one of my favorite parts of miniature painting, because I think that adding the tufts right at the end kind of really breathes a lot of life into the piece. And yeah, I did kind of go heavy with the moss. I just really like the look of them. But I did try to intersperse the different types so you kind of get a good mix and it looks a bit more natural. And I also did make a conscious decision to not place too many of the longer tufts in the foreground so as to not obscure the lizard too much from the front. And after I cleaned up the surface on the plinth a bit, this is what the end result looked like. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!